They laughed when the sensor report came in, because no civilization that fielded such a small force had ever survived first contact with the Carthax coalition. The alien fleet translated into the Sol system with disciplined precision, its vessels forming geometric attack patterns refined over centuries of conquest. Energy signatures spiked, weapon arrays aligned, and long-range scanners swept the inner planets. What they found was underwhelming. A handful of ships in loose orbit. No planetary shield net. No heavy carriers. No defensive armada worthy of concern. Supreme strategist Velrix studied the holographic display in silence. His cybernetic eyes processed millions of data points per second, cross-referencing historical conquests, predictive resistance models, and probability curves. Every calculation reached the same conclusion. This would be easy. 12 ships, Velrix said at last, his tone controlled but faintly amused. Is that their entire military response? Yes, strategist, replied the sensor officer. Confirmed. Minimal mass, outdated propulsion signatures, limited weapons output. Ground-based forces appear fragmented. A low ripple of restrained laughter passed through the command bridge. The Carthax coalition had dismantled empires that commanded fleets 10 times larger. They had annihilated Death World species that boasted stronger gravity, harsher climates, and more aggressive biologies than these so-called humans. Transmit surrender terms, Velrix ordered. Standard protocol. Inform them resistance is inefficient. The message was sent, precise, formal, absolute. There was no reply. Minutes passed. The human ships did not maneuver. They did not power weapons. They did not flee. They simply held position, scattered in a formation so loose it bordered on careless. Fear response, one officer remarked. They lack centralized command. Velrix nodded. Typical. Advance the fleet. Maintain intimidation posture. What none of them noticed was the absence of panic signals. No civilian evacuation. No frantic communications. No signs of internal collapse. For a species supposedly unprepared for war, humanity was remarkably quiet. Deep beneath the surface of Earth, in a hardened command facility carved into ancient stone, Admiral Jonathan Hale watched the same fleet from a different perspective. The holographic display before him showed enemy vessels advancing with perfect symmetry, their trajectory smooth, predictable, almost elegant. They think we're afraid, a young analyst said. Hale allowed himself a thin smile. Good. Around the table sat men and women who had spent decades studying failure. Historians of lost battles. Engineers who specialized in systems breaking under stress. Cyber warfare experts who understood that modern combat was less about firepower and more about control. Humanity did not have the largest fleet. It never had. What it had was experience surviving stronger enemies. Status, Hale said. Phase 1 is active, replied the cybernetics officer. Passive insertion complete. No alarms triggered. The alien fleet continued forward, unaware that its own communication lattice was being gently observed, mapped, and mirrored. Human cyber systems did not attack. They listened. They learned. Coalition doctrine assumed enemies would try to overpower their networks. Humans had learned long ago that patience often did more damage than aggression. Above Earth, small human satellites adjusted their orbits by fractions of a degree. Not enough to be noticed. Enough to matter later. The coalition fleet reached optimal engagement distance. Final surrender warning, Velrix commanded. Again, silence. His confidence hardened into irritation. Prepare precision strikes. Disable orbital assets only. I want survivors for compliance integration. At that exact moment, coalition sensors flickered. Just briefly. Report, Velrix snapped. Minor telemetry disturbance, the officer said. Likely stellar interference. It was not the star. Human cyber teams had just finished validating coalition navigation assumptions. The aliens relied on internal redundancy, so robust it bordered on arrogance. They trusted their systems because nothing had ever broken them. Nothing, until now. The first Coalition ship did not explode. Its engines simply failed. Power readings fluctuated wildly, then stabilized at zero thrust. A second ship reported guidance anomalies. A third drifted out of formation. Valric straightened. Explain. Engineers flooded the bridge with data. No common failure point. No weapons fire detected. No external damage. That's impossible, an officer muttered. No, Valrix corrected slowly, his amusement gone. It is improbable. Human ships finally moved. Not aggressively. Not dramatically. They repositioned with deliberate calm, sliding into vectors that made no immediate sense. One vessel fired a single shot, not at an enemy ship, but at empty space along a calculated coordinate. Space bent. Coalition vessels shuddered as gravity gradients twisted violently. Formation integrity collapsed. 3 ships collided, their hulls tearing under forces their designers had never planned for. On oath, Admiral Hale exhaled slowly. "Mark that," he said. "They've noticed." For the first time since entering the system, the Carthax coalition stopped advancing. And for the first time in centuries, an alien fleet began to understand that the tiny army before them was not weak. It was human. The alien fleet did not retreat. It paused, recalculated, and attempted to reassert control, because the Carthax coalition had never believed in coincidence. Supreme Strategist Valric stood motionless as damage reports scrolled across the display. 3 vessels lost to gravitational shear. 4 more drifting out of alignment. No confirmed enemy weapons impact. No identifiable attack vector. The data offended his sense of order. "Lock down all autonomous subsystems," he ordered. "Switch to manual command authority. I want redundancy led on redundancy." The bridge complied instantly. Coalition doctrine treated uncertainty as a temporary inconvenience, something to be corrected through discipline and superior processing power. Their systems tightened, isolating functions, sealing internal networks, narrowing decision paths. And in doing so, they made the second mistake. On Ith, Admiral Hale watched the change ripple through the enemy fleet. The once fluid formation stiffened. Communication delays increased by fractions of a second. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. To a human strategist, it was an opening wide enough to drive a carrier through. "They are centralizing," Hale said. "They think control equals safety." A senior analyst nodded. "It always does, until it doesn't." Human cyber teams adjusted their approach. Instead of nudging systems at the edges, they fed coalition command nodes perfectly reasonable data, accurate readings, clean numbers, flawless reports. The trick was not deception. It was timing. Coalition ships began responding to threats that were no longer there, compensating for maneuvers already completed, aligning weapons toward empty coordinates. Each response was logical. Each decision correct in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern of delay. Valrix sensed it before the systems confirmed it. The fleet was still powerful, still intact, but it was losing initiative. The humans were not reacting. They were guiding. "Deploy reconnaissance drones," he ordered. "Visual confirmation. I want eyes on their ships." Hundreds of sleek drones launched, fanning outward with practiced efficiency. They were fast, autonomous, and expendable, designed to map battlefields before resistance could adapt. Human ships did not fire. Instead, small objects detached from their hulls and drifted into space. Irregular, unpowered, barely detectable. Debris. The drones adjusted course automatically, filtering out non-threatening mass. Coalition algorithms were excellent at prioritizing danger. The debris wasn't dangerous. Until it was. Human signals activated embedded charges milliseconds before contact. Not explosions, bursts of electromagnetic noise tuned precisely to coalition sensor frequencies. Drone feeds went white, then dark. Others began transmitting contradictory data, false echoes multiplying until the battlespace became unreadable. Valrix slammed a clawed hand against the command rail. "Purge the drone network." Too late. The confusion had already spread upstream. Humanity had not built better senses. They had learned how to blind superior ones. The coalition fleet began to maneuver defensively, ships drifting closer together, overlapping fire arcs in a textbook response to perceived encirclement. To coalition strategists, proximity meant protection. To human planners, it meant efficiency. "Authorize Phase 3, Hale said quietly. Human vessels fired in sequence, not at enemy hulls, but at specific points along the fleet's projected motion paths. The weapons were not powerful by coalition standards. They did not need to be. Each strike altered momentum. Each correction forced another adjustment. Coalition ships began expending fuel to maintain formation, their perfect geometry degrading into something crowded and tense. "Why aren't they attacking us directly?" a coalition officer asked, confusion leaking into his voice. Velrix did not answer immediately. He was staring at a long-range plot that made his cybernetic implants ache. "They are shaping the battlefield," he said at last. "They intend to decide where we fail." The realization unsettled the bridge. The coalition had always imposed conditions, never responded to them. Human ships closed the distance, still refusing direct confrontation. Their movements were conservative, precise, almost restrained. It felt insulting. Then the first coalition escort vanished from sensors. No explosion. No debris cloud. Just gone. A localized distortion flared and collapsed, space folding back into itself like water closing over a stone. The ship had been pulled into a gravity well that should not have existed. "That technology is inefficient," one officer said weakly. "The energy cost is irrelevant if it works once," Velrix snapped. He finally understood what kind of enemy he faced. Humans did not seek dominance. They sought leverage. On Ith, Hale felt the weight of the decision pressing on him. They could escalate. They could finish this faster. But speed carried risk, and risk carried civilian cost. "Hold," he ordered. "Let them exhaust themselves." Human doctrine did not reward haste. It rewarded survival. Coalition commanders argued among themselves, their unity fraying as uncertainty replaced confidence. Orders overlapped. Counter-orders followed. The fleet remained lethal, but its rhythm was broken. Velrix stared at the human formation, small and maddeningly calm. "They should be afraid," he said quietly. "Any rational species would be afraid." A junior officer swallowed. "Perhaps this is how they fight." The thought settled over the bridge like a shadow. Humanity was not panicking. Humanity was managing risk, preserving options, choosing restraint not because it lacked power, but because it had learned the cost of using it carelessly. For the first time, Velrix considered withdrawal. Not defeat. Not yet. But uncertainty had entered the equation, and uncertainty was dangerous. Across the void, human ships adjusted position once more, tightening a net that had never looked like a net until it was almost closed. The aliens had mocked a tiny army. Now they were trapped inside its calculations. And somewhere in the coalition's vast databases, a new, uncomfortable question was beginning to form, one no strategist had ever needed to ask before. What if the humans were still holding back? Velrix had commanded fleets through plasma storms, collapsed stars, and the coordinated resistance of species that believed desperation could substitute for strategy. None of that prepared him for the sensation now spreading through the coalition command network. The humans were not winning. They were refusing to lose. That distinction mattered. The coalition fleet attempted to re-establish initiative by force. Heavy cruisers powered up their primary weapons, massive arrays capable of annihilating cities from orbit. Energy levels spiked across the formation as firing solutions were calculated and recalculated, each adjustment slightly delayed by the noise still lingering in the sensor net. "Fire," Velrix ordered. The void lit up. Coalition weapons tore through space in disciplined volleys, beams and kinetic lances converging on the human ships. The firepower was overwhelming, beautiful in its precision. And it missed. Human vessels did not dodge at the last second. They did not flee. They altered course minutes earlier, adjusting trajectories so subtly that coalition prediction algorithms never flagged the change as evasive action. Where the weapons struck, there was only empty space and fading radiation. Human ships returned fire sparingly. A few shots, carefully placed. Not enough to destroy, but enough to force correction. Coalition gunners found themselves chasing targets that seemed to anticipate every move. "This is statistically impossible," a fire control officer said, voice tight. "No," Valrix replied. "It is experimental." The humans were not calculating faster. They were calculating differently. On oath, Admiral Hale watched the exchange with grim focus. The room around him was quiet, every analyst locked into their station. The coalition's firepower was finally fully engaged. The margin for error was narrowing. "They are frustrated," Hale said. "That's good. Frustration leads to aggression. And aggression leads to mistakes," an aide finished. A new alert chimed softly. "Sir," the cybernetics officer said, "we're seeing anomalies in coalition command traffic. Internal disputes. Competing directives." Hale nodded. "They don't decentralize well. Never needed to." Humanity had learned the opposite lesson long ago. Redundancy was not just hardware. It was philosophy. Human command structures allowed disagreement, improvisation, even failure, so long as the mission survived. Coalition ships began breaking formation in small ways, captains making local decisions to protect their vessels rather than the fleet as a whole. It was sensible. It was human. And it was fatal to coalition doctrine. Valrix felt the cohesion slipping. His orders were still followed, but not instantly. Not perfectly. Trust in the system was eroding, and trust was the coalition's greatest weapon. "Bring us closer," he said suddenly. Close engagement. Remove their advantage. Several officers hesitated. At close range, one said carefully, "Their gravitational and electronic interference will affect them as well," Valrix snapped. "They are not immune to physics." The flagship surged forward, heavy escorts following. The distance between fleets shrank, space growing crowded with mass, energy, and tension. Human command reacted immediately. "Flagship advancing," an analyst warned. Hale studied the projection. This was the point he had hoped to avoid, but prepared for. "They want proximity," he said. "They think it negates finesse." He paused, then gave the order. "Release the anchors." Human ships deployed devices the coalition had detected earlier but dismissed as inert. Small, dense objects unfolded into complex shapes, their mass signatures spiking sharply. They did not move. Space moved around them. Localized gravity wells bloomed, overlapping just enough to distort vectors without tearing anything apart. Coalition ships struggled as inertial dampeners fought forces they were never designed to counter. Thrusters roared as captains attempted to maintain control. The flagship shuddered. Valrix gripped the command rail, his cybernetics feeding him a flood of conflicting data. Gravity vectors. Hull stress. Energy bleed. "This technology is crude," he growled. "Inelegant. But effective," an officer whispered. Before Valrix could respond, a human transmission cut through the noise. "Clear. Calm. Unencrypted. This is Admiral Jonathan Hale," the voice said. "We recommend you stop advancing." The bridge went silent. Valrix stared at the emitter as if it had insulted him personally. "They dare issue recommendations." "Sir," an aide said, "our maneuvering margin is decreasing. If we continue, we risk collision," Valrix finished quietly. He had no intention of obeying a human suggestion. But he also had no intention of losing ships to stubbornness. "Hold position," he ordered. The fleet slowed, massive vessels fighting inertia as space itself resisted them. On Earth, Hale exhaled slowly. They had crossed a line. Direct communication meant the coalition finally recognized them as peers, if not equals. That recognition carried risk. Human analysts began reporting increased coalition power buildup. Weapon capacitors charging beyond previous levels. A final strike was being prepared, something decisive. They are going to try to break through, someone said. Yes, Hale replied. And they'll choose the most obvious path. He looked at the map, at the gravity anchors, at the subtle web already in place. Let them. The coalition fleet surged one last time, concentrating fire, momentum, and will into a narrow corridor they believed was weak. It was exactly where the humans wanted them. As the first coalition ship crossed the threshold, space twisted sharply. The gravity anchors resonated, amplifying each other in a cascading effect. Ships slammed into braking fields, collided with one another, or spun helplessly as control vanished. The corridor collapsed into chaos. Veilrix watched his fleet unravel in stunned silence. Not destroyed. Neutralized. The humans had not beaten them with strength. They had beaten them with understanding. And as the coalition flagship drifted, trapped but intact, a thought settled heavily in Veilrix's mind, one that sent a chill through his species' collective pride. If this was what humans could do while holding back, what would happen if they ever stopped? The silence that followed was heavier than any explosion. Coalition vessels drifted in fractured formations, their engines throttled down not by damage alone, but by necessity. Gravity anchors pulsed steadily around them, invisible hands gripping mass and momentum with patient insistence. Every attempt to accelerate only worsened the strain, forcing captains to choose between pride and survival. Supreme strategist Veilrix stood amid the subdued hum of the flagship, his mind racing faster than the crippled processes around him. Reports flowed in, hull integrity stable, weapon systems functional, casualties minimal. By all conventional measures, the fleet remained combat-capable. And yet it was trapped, not by chains or shields, but by consequences. They are not finishing us, Veilrix said quietly. No, strategist, an aide replied. Human vessels are holding position. No further hostile action detected. The realization cut deeper than any loss of ships. The coalition had been neutralized without being annihilated, placed in a position where every aggressive option led to mutual destruction, or worse, unnecessary loss. The humans had created a dilemma. On oath, Admiral Hale listened to the same data with equal gravity. Victory was within reach, but it was a brittle thing. Push too hard, and the coalition might lash out. Pull back too soon, and the lesson would be lost. Status on civilian risk, Hale asked. Minimal, an analyst replied. Their weapons are powered, but firing solutions would require braking formation. They know it. Hale nodded. The aliens were rational. That had always been the hope. A message request appeared on the display. Coalition Command, the communications officer said. They are asking for clarification. Hale allowed himself a small, tired smile. Put them through. Veilrix's image formed above the table, tall and angular, his cybernetics glowing faintly as they compensated for stress and uncertainty. He did not look defeated. He looked offended. You have demonstrated capability, Veilrix said without preamble. Explain your objective. Hale met his gaze evenly. You entered our system with a fleet designed for compliance and conquest. Our objective is to ensure you leave with a reason not to return. Veilrix's mandibles tightened. You could have destroyed us. Yes, Hale said. We chose not to. Why? The question was not rhetorical. It was sincere. Hale considered his answer carefully. Because destruction teaches fear. Understanding teaches restraint. We prefer the second. The coalition bridge was silent behind Veilrix. He processed the statement not as philosophy, but as strategy. Fear created enemies desperate enough to innovate. Restraint created boundaries. You risk appearing weak, Veilrix said. Hale shook his head slightly. No. We risk appearing human. The transmission ended. For several long moments, Veilrix remained motionless. Around him, his officers waited, some tense, some confused, some quietly relieved. Coalition doctrine offered no guidance for this situation. There was no victory condition that accounted for mercy used as leverage. They are not bluffing, Veilrix said at last. If we attempt a full-force breakthrough, we will lose ships, perhaps the fleet. And if we withdraw, an officer asked. Velrix looked back at the projection of Sol, at the small human ships holding a net they did not tighten further. Then we'll lose something else. Prestige. Certainty. The myth of inevitability. On Earth, Hale watched the Coalition fleet carefully. Every human vessel held position, weapons powered down just enough to signal intent without surrendering readiness. It was a delicate balance, one mistake away from catastrophe. They are deciding, Anade said. Yes, Hale replied. And they are not used to deciding like this. Coalition command channels erupted into debate. Some argued for escalation, unwilling to accept anything less than dominance. Others urged withdrawal, citing unacceptable strategic uncertainty. The fleet had never faced an opponent who turned victory into a choice rather than an outcome. Velrix listened to them all, then raised a clawed hand. Enough, he said. The room fell silent. We came here assuming numbers define power, he continued. We assumed technology defined superiority. We were incorrect. He straightened, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of doctrine bending under new reality. Prepare a controlled withdrawal. Maintain defensive posture. No further provocations. Several officers stared at him in shock. Strategist, one said carefully, this will be remembered. Yes, Velrix replied. That is precisely the point. Across the void, Coalition ships began to disengage, one by one, carefully extricating themselves from the gravity web with human assistance they did not acknowledge but could not refuse. The anchors powered down gradually, releasing the fleet without pursuit. Human vessels did not follow. They watched. On Earth, a quiet exhale rippled through the command center. Analysts slumped back in their chairs. Some smiled. Others simply closed their eyes for a moment. Hale remained standing. This isn't over, he said softly. They'll adapt. But they'll think twice, Anade replied. Yes, Hale agreed. And sometimes, that's enough. As the last Coalition ship translated out of the system, Velrix recorded a private note in the fleet archive, one not intended for public doctrine. Humans did not fight to conquer. They fought to control outcomes. And any species that mistook restraint for weakness would not get a second warning. Far from Sol, as the fleet limped home carrying intact hulls and damaged certainty, a new strategic classification began circulating quietly through Coalition intelligence. Humanity was no longer considered a minor power. It was considered a problem, one that would require far more than a large fleet to solve. The Coalition fleet was gone, but the consequences of its arrival remained. Debris fields drifted where gravity had been bent and released. Sensor echoes lingered like ghosts, fading slowly as space-time relaxed back into something resembling normalcy. For hours after the last alien vessel vanished, human ships held their positions, weapons warm, crews alert. No one celebrated. Not yet. On Earth, Admiral Hale stood alone in the observation chamber, watching the system settle. Victory was a dangerous word. It invited complacency. What mattered was survival, and what followed it. Status, he said quietly. All human vessels accounted for, came the reply. No civilian casualties. Infrastructure intact. The anchors are powering down cleanly. Hale nodded. They had threaded the needle. Barely. Across the stars, Supreme Strategist Velrix sat in silence aboard his flagship, the hum of retreat engines a constant reminder of something he had never experienced before. The fleet was intact. No worlds lost. No annihilation recorded. And yet, he felt diminished. Coalition doctrine defined victory as control of space, resources, and outcomes. Humans had denied all three without destroying a single capital ship. They had forced a retreat not by strength alone, but by making every alternative worse. That kind of opponent unsettled him. Strategist, Anade said cautiously, the Council will demand justification. Velrix did not look up. They will receive it. And punishment. Perhaps, he replied. But punishment is preferable to extinction. The aide hesitated, then asked the question no one else would. Do you believe the humans could have destroyed us? Veilrix's cybernetic eyes dimmed slightly as he replayed the battle, every subtle adjustment, every trap disguised as restraint. "Yes," he said. "I believe they chose not to." Back in Sol, human ships finally began their return maneuvers. Crews moved with the quiet efficiency of professionals who understood what had been at stake. Damage reports were filed. Lessons were logged. Simulations updated. In one briefing room, analysts argued over data, voices sharp with exhaustion and adrenaline. "They adapted faster than expected," one said. "They centralized too quickly," another countered. "That was the flaw. They'll fix it next time." The room fell quiet at that. Admiral Hale entered without ceremony. "You're all correct," he said. "They'll adapt. And so will we." A younger officer frowned. "So, do you think there will be a next time?" Hale met his gaze. "Yes. But not soon. And not carelessly." He gestured to the display, now showing the empty space where the Coalition fleet had been. "We didn't just win a battle. We changed an equation." Humanity went back to work. Shipyards expanded quietly. Research teams dissected sensor logs, refining gravity manipulation and cybernetic countermeasures. Defensive networks were adjusted, not to project power, but to complicate it. No grand announcements were made. No declarations issued. That, too, was deliberate. Far beyond human space, Coalition intelligence struggled to update threat assessments. Models failed. Simulations contradicted each other. Humans did not fit established categories. Their behavior defied predictive curves. They were not expansionist. They were not submissive. They were not reckless. They were patient. Veilrix stood before the Coalition Council weeks later, his posture rigid, his voice controlled. "Humanity does not seek conquest," he told them. "They seek leverage. Any future engagement must account for that." One counselor scoffed. "You allowed a minor species to dictate terms." "I allowed them to demonstrate capability," Veilrix replied. "The alternative was unnecessary loss." Loss is the price of dominance. Only when dominance is possible, Veilrix said evenly. Against humans, it is not guaranteed. The chamber erupted in debate. That debate would continue for years. On oath, Hale recorded his final report and sealed it under restricted access. The last line was not tactical. It was philosophical. Humanity had survived because it remembered something many advanced species forgot. War was not about proving strength. It was about choosing outcomes you could live with. As the Sol system returned to routine traffic, most civilians never learned how close the edge had been. That was fine. Civilization endured precisely because someone else stood watch. In deep space, a Coalition scout vessel paused at the edge of human sensor range, observing silently before turning away. No provocation. No test. Just caution. And somewhere in a human archive, alongside lessons drawn from ancient battles and near-forgotten wars, a new entry was added, brief, precise, and intentionally understated. First contact, Carthax Coalition. Result, inconclusive. Strategic outcome, favorable. Beneath it, a note only a few would ever read. When they laughed at our tiny army, they revealed their greatest weakness. They assumed numbers defined power. They forgot what human soldiers were trained to do when the odds were impossible. They think we are a problem now. If they ever return, we will be the solution.